Have you ever wondered about African Americans that played a part in your state's history? Those of you who find history interesting probably have. Every state has many people in its history that have influenced others. When I moved to Minnesota, I dove into research about African Americans who have influenced this state's history. Today I'll give you highlights about a few African Americans that have influenced Minnesota's history. First, let's talk about some general African American facts about Minnesota. African Americans have been living in Minnesota since the 1800s, 50 years before Minnesota became a state. Some of the earliest black African Americans were fugitive slaves who escaped from Mississippi River to Minnesota. In 1868, after Minnesota granted black men the right to vote, most black families settled in the Twin Cities, but the small communities when they settled have become known as the following: Duluth, Stillwater, Fergus Falls, Faribault, Aitkin County, and Redwood Falls. Black Americans were just like the European immigrants in the state because they moved to Minnesota for the job opportunities and to live a better life. Now that you know some of the basic facts, let me introduce you to a few prominent men. B.J. Franklin Weeds was a prominent black African American in the 1890s. He was the first African American man elected into the House of Representatives in 1898. He sponsored a significant civil rights bill that passed in 1899. The bill outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. The next prominent man was a police officer, James Burrell of St. Paul. He was the first black police officer in 1892. It took 100 years after that for another black man to become of importance on the police force. Lastly, let me introduce you to Frederickson McGee. He's the first African American to practice criminal law in Minnesota. In 1899, he founded many civil rights organizations. He was also prominent in the Catholic Church before his death. This article here, African Americans in Minnesota History, is where I received all my information here. As my audience here knows, I've given you some basic facts about Minnesota's history with African Americans and their prominence on their black culture and prominent men that came over and their history. Even if you're not a history fan, hopefully it sparked a little bit of interest in you. Maybe you can go and look up some history on your own. Now that you know a little bit more about African Americans and Minnesota, I strongly encourage you to dig into your local history and learn something new. You never know when it will benefit you or benefit others.